Hi everyone, today's Yellowstone podcast is about the Fairy Falls Hiking Trail, which is, in my opinion at least, the most popular front country hiking trail in Yellowstone. And you're probably asking yourself, well, what do you mean by front country? Well, I'm talking about the difference between front country and backcountry. And it's one of those deals where if somebody says to you, well, what is the difference between front country and backcountry? Well, you know it when you see it, but very basically, front country means an area which is easily accessible by car, an area where you're not going to get too far away from civilization, an area where you're reasonably close to technology and help if you need it, whereas the backcountry refers to more of a remote, undeveloped, rural area. So in Yellowstone, you'd be deep in the forests or far across the meadows or up the mountains and pretty far away from anything. So, Fairy Falls, and as I said, is probably Yellowstone's most popular front country trail. And I've often wondered why this is. I don't want to give anything away, but in my opinion, Fairy Falls just is not a particularly attractive waterfall, and that may be because the sun never seems to shine on it and it always looks so grey and gloomy. But the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot is right next to the Grand Loop Road. So if you're on Yellowstone's lower loop, so the lower circle of Yellowstone, you'll find the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot about, I would guess, maybe a mile and a half from the Midway Geyser Basin. It's kind of like when somebody says to me, hey, how do I find a bear in Yellowstone? And I say, well, that's really easy. Just look for the big crowds. Well, how do I find the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot? Easy as well. Look for a parking lot that is right next to the road that is jam-packed with crowds, because that is always what the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot looks like. Even though the Park Service a few years ago put an extension onto it, you can never find a parking spot there unless you go really early in the morning. So my first piece of advice to you is try and get there early in the morning if you do want to find a parking spot that's reasonably close by. My second piece of advice is more important. Make sure that you have bear spray with you. Well, you may say to yourself, well, the Fairy Falls Trail is so popular, there's other people on the trail, why do I need bear spray? You need bear spray in so many places within Yellowstone. Basically, any time you get away from a built-up area, take your bear spray with you. It was June the 22nd of 2020, when there was actually a woman attacked by a bear on the Fairy Falls Trail. Fortunately, she had bear spray with her, and she tried to use it. She wasn't that successful. She wasn't injured that badly. It was just a case of a bear mom trying to make sure that her cubs didn't suffer any damage, so the Park Service didn't take any action against the bear. So both the bear and the person were lucky. Talking of bears, the Park Service generally recommends that you hike in groups of 3 or more. I seem to recall being told at one of the training sessions that the Park Service at Yellowstone runs for tour operators like ours. When you operate a tour company within Yellowstone, you have to have what's called a CUA, which is basically a permit, a conditional use authority to operate in Yellowstone. And the Park Service has these incredible training sessions, and you go there, and I seem to recall being told that there's never been an attack on a group of 6 or more people by a bear. So before I did this podcast, I went online to try and find a source for that, and I was unable to, but I'm pretty sure that I heard that. It stands to reason, though, the more people there are in your group, or the more people around you, the less likely it is that a bear is going to attack you. So try and hike in groups of 3 or more if you're by yourself. Maybe join up with others. The Fairy Falls Trail actually has two different trailheads. The most popular one is the Trailhead Parking Lot that I mentioned before, that is to the south of the Midway Geyser Basin, and the Midway Geyser Basin is where Grand Prismatic Spring is. But there is another one as well, and this is at the end of Fountain Flat Drive. That one is not anywhere near as popular because it's a much longer trail to get to the Fairy Falls Trail itself, and I'll tell you more about that. I think it's 3.4 miles from the end of Fountain Lake Drive to the turnoff to Fairy Falls, where it's only 1 mile from the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot to the turnoff to Fairy Falls. However, the trail between Fountain Flat Drive and the Fairy Falls Trail parking lot is one of the few places in the park where you're actually allowed to ride your bicycle. So what I often do, in fact always do, is take my bicycle. I generally park my car at the Fountain Flat Trailhead parking lot, and that is never crowded. There's always people there. There's always enough parking there. Hop on my mountain bike, and it's a very, very pleasant ride. Going past, amongst other things, Goose Lakes, which are some very pretty lakes along that trail. Now, you're not allowed to take your bike on the part of the trail from where the turnoff to Fairy Falls itself is, but you can leave it there and then hike the rest of the way. So let's talk a little bit now about how long the trail is. The trail itself, depending on which source you go to online, the National Park Service says it's about 5.4 miles or 8.6 kilometers, whereas other resources say it's about 4.9 miles or a little under 8 kilometers. That will just give you a very rough idea. So let's say now that we've managed to find a parking spot in the Fairy Falls Trailhead parking lot. You leave your car there, you've got your bear spray with you, you've got some water with you, you've got on a good pair of walking shoes, and you'll make your way across the Firehole River. And pretty soon you'll see a sign that says, "Caution, look out for bears." I do need to mention that this trail generally only opens towards the end of May because the National Park Service has it closed for what they call bear management. The National Park Service knows where bears, particularly with their cubs, are likely to be, and they will close those areas off, especially when the cubs are really young, to stop interaction and conflict between bears and people. So unfortunately, that trail is going to be closed off starting from the time the park opens, which is generally the third Monday in April, until late May. So keep your eyes open, go to the Park Service website and take a look and see when the trail opens. You go across the Firehole River, you will then see that the scenery is really open. You'll pass a few smaller thermal features, and when I say thermal features, that's an all-encompassing term referring to geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and fumaroles. And in this case, the thermal features that you see are for the most part hot springs. You come to a sign that says the Midway Geyser Basin. You can see the Firehole River off to your right. Now, this part of the trail is always, as you might imagine, really crowded. There are a lot of people on this part of the trail, so you have to enjoy the great outdoors with, who knows, several hundred or 1,000 of your closest friends. But still, it's a very pleasant experience as you make your way along the trail, and you'll then come to a little hill to the left of the trail, more or less what would be to the southwest of the trail. You can see the steam coming off Grand Prismatic Spring and especially Excelsior Geyser Crater. So it's pretty easy to see where the main boardwalk part of the Midway Geyser Basin is. Where that little hill is, the Park Service a few years ago put in a trail that takes you up to this really cool overlook of Grand Prismatic Spring. If you've ever wondered where those pictures are, that you see online of Grand Prismatic shot from above, well, that's where most of them were taken. Before the Park Service put the trail in, what we used to do is we used to just walk up the hill further than the platform which the Park Service has put in now, which is probably, I guess, about a third of the way up. But it's so much easier on the trail that they've put in, and the platform, even though it's not all the way at the top of the hill, still will provide you with spectacular views of Grand Prismatic. You don't have to go down to the bottom the same trail that you took up. If you have a look carefully at the other side of the platform, once you get off the platform, you'll see that there's another trail that you can take, which will basically put you in the same direction as the trail that you're on down at the bottom. So there's basically an in trail and an out trail, an up trail and a down trail. And take that one down, you'll get down to the bottom, and although you won't really be able to see the magnificent colors of Grand Prismatic Spring, it's still really cool because you've got all these dead trees, what we call bobby socks trees. And those old timers like me who are listening to this will know what I mean by a bobby soxer. Basically, the trees have got this white area at the bottom, which kind of looks like a bobby sock, and that is the sinter that is brought up from underground by the thermal features, and I talk about that a lot more in other of these Yellowstone podcasts. So you do get some great pictures. One thing, guys, that I haven't mentioned, in addition to this podcast, we also have narrated videos of this hike and so many other hikes and other aspects of Yellowstone, which you can see on YouTube, and you can also access them by going to our site virtualyellowstonetours.com. That's virtualyellowstonetours.com. Just search for this particular hike, Fairy Falls, and you'll see we have several options. Click on a link and that'll take you to YouTube, and at YouTube you can watch the actual video of the entire hike from the Fairy Falls Trailhead Parking Lot all the way to Fairy Falls, with a couple of other features thrown in as well. The other way that you can look for it is if you go to YouTube and search for Yellowstone Tours. Search for Yellowstone Tours without a space in between. YouTube will ask you, hey, did you mean to put in Yellowstone Space Tours? You say, no, I want Yellowstone Tours. Click on that. That'll take you directly to our YouTube channel. You can see the videos there as well. Anyway, sorry to digress. You will carry on walking, and pretty soon you'll see an area where you can either carry on going straight or you can turn left, which is to the west. If you continued straight, that is the trail that I was talking about, which will take you to Fountain Flat Drive. And as I mentioned before, it's a really pretty drive. There's, a very really pretty trail. There's nobody on the trail. The crowds will now disappear. You'll pretty much have just about all of it to yourself. You may come across the odd bison or the odd elk, which indeed you might have seen on the way from the Fairy Falls Trailhead Parking Lot to where you are now. So let's turn left or west, and we'll make our way through an area that is full of young lodgepole pines. Now, the lodgepole pine is the predominant tree in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and this particular area that you're going through now is an area that was really badly burnt during the Great Fire of 1988, and the trees that you are walking through are the ones that have grown since that fire. There aren't quite as many people on this part of the trail as there were on the first part, and it's a very pleasant walk through the Lodgepole Pines until you get to Fairy Falls itself. I told you earlier that Fairy Falls is not one of my favorite waterfalls, but I seem to be in a minority of one because everybody else seems to love Fairy Falls. I believe it's the highest front country waterfall. It's 200 feet or 61 meters high, and it is formed by Fairy Creek, which tumbles down over the Madison Plateau, creating Fairy Falls. There's is quite a bit to see and explore there. There's some wonderful old trees that you can walk over and around. Please be really, really careful, though. You don't want to fall and hurt yourself. Now we get to the part of the trail which to me is the most exciting, and which for me has made the hike to Fairy Falls all worthwhile. A few years ago, the Park Service put in an additional trail of approximately half a mile, although some people say it's 0.6 of a mile or 0.97 kilometers. So approximately half a mile or 0.8 kilometers to go from Fairy Falls to Imperial Geyser. And this is the part of the trail that I really love doing. It is just so spectacularly beautiful. Now, you may miss the trailhead. In order to find it, keep your back to Fairy Falls, walk back the way that you came, and you'll see there's a little stream to your left, basically Fairy Creek, which I mentioned before. Look carefully and you can see a trail that starts on this side of the creek and then continues on the other side, and that'll take you to Imperial Geyser. And this part of the trail, as I say, I find to be really stunning, with Imperial Geyser being the cherry on the top, more than the cherry on the top, 100 cherries on the top. You'll make your way then on this new trail, and you'll go through the forest. You'll get into an open meadow, just this really stunning open meadow. And when you're in that meadow and you're looking ahead of you, which is basically to the northwest, you'll see a hill off in the distance, and the trail will take you towards that hill. You'll then get into the forest again, and you'll come to a point where you could either basically continue straight or go right, and that is a loop trail, and whichever way you go there, with any luck, you should get to Imperial Geyser. I like to stay left at this point, and I'll explain why shortly. So we continue on through the forest. Keep your eyes open to the right, because the turnoff, if you like, to Imperial Geyser is not signposted, but you'll see a hole in the trees, or a space in the trees, and if you look through there, you'll see some sinter. In fact, if you've kept your eyes open, you will have noticed sinter for the last few minutes. And remember, sinter is that white, pale sort of mineral that gives the ground a pale or a white hue. And the sinter is brought up from underground by the thermal features. And whenever you see sinter, you know that there either is a thermal area there or there was a thermal area there. So look out for that sinter, turn right when you can. That'll take you to Imperial Geyser. What I love about Imperial Geyser is that the pool surrounding Imperial Geyser is just so beautiful, with its shades of blue and green. With any luck, Imperial Geyser will be erupting. It always seems to erupt. The eruptions only generally get up to about 15 feet high, so they're not that high, but it's still a stunning area. And then if you, once you've got Imperial Geyser more or less in front of you and the trail that you've come in on behind you, and you go to the right, you'll see that there's another trail, and you'll notice some bacteria mats. Now, bacteria mats are formed when the water that comes off the thermal features starts cooling down, and more thermophiles, heat-loving organisms and other bacteria are able to survive in the water because it's not so hot, and you've got these really stunning colors. I always used to regard the bacteria mats coming off Sapphire Pool in Biscuit Basin as being the most just brilliant in all of Yellowstone. But now I'm starting to think that I prefer the ones at Imperial Geyser. Anyway, if you follow the bacteria mats and then the stream coming off Imperial Geyser, that'll take you to another geyser called Spray Geyser. You can't get as close to Spray Geyser as you could with Imperial Geyser, but still you can see that it is there. One thing that I haven't mentioned and that you do need to take into consideration at a place like Imperial Geyser or Monument Geyser Basin or any of these front country or backcountry thermal areas, there's no ranger there, there's no boardwalks there, so you really do need to respect the environment and be very careful to protect yourselves. In many thermal areas, the ground is very thin, perhaps an inch or a couple of centimeters or even less. And if you're not careful, you can tumble through into the thermal waters below, which are going to be really hot. They can and will injure you, and they could even kill you. So please be careful in these areas. So we've gone past Spray Geyser. We now continue, and remember I told you that this part of the trail is a big loop. You'll join up with the trailhead where you were previously, and you'll now continue back to Fairy Falls and then continue all the way back to the Fairy Falls trail parking lot. Guys, I hope that I've given you some useful information in this Yellowstone podcast about this hike. If you need any other information, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can text 406-219-8885. That's 406-219-8885. You can also email hike@yellowstonedayhikes.com. And remember, if you'd like a guided hike of this hike, we do offer it, as well as many others, and you can see that again at yellowstonedayhikes.com. You can see all of our virtual Yellowstone tours at virtualyellowstonetours.com. So check out the route, check out the trail before you get here. And finally, all of our Yellowstone podcasts can be accessed at yellowstonepodcasts.com. That's yellowstonepodcasts.com. Thank you for joining me on another one of our Yellowstone podcasts, and I hope you make it to Yellowstone someday. See ya.